In the years before the NCAA and conferences, before the game became what it is today, college football existed on an ever-shifting frontier, one that extended beyond the borders of the United States and into the northern lands of Canada. The Ivies would often play schools like McGill and Toronto as the sport evolved on the sidelines. When football spread to the Midwest and Upper Plains, so too did the frontier. Schools in Michigan would mingle with schools in Ontario. And there was even at least one account of a college football team meeting a pro-Canadian team when the North Dakota State Bison met the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Yet as the sport became more stratified, the fluid frontier would calcify, and the international escapades would end. During this time, the South too would venture into a new frontier, yet one with a little bit more sunshine. The Bacardi Bowl was a postseason game played intermittently across the first half of the 20th century in the Caribbean nation of Cuba. When the first bowl was played, Cuba itself was only 5 years removed from American occupation, following the Spanish-American War, and this game was one of many representations of lingering American presence in the now independent island nation. It was to be played during the Cuban National Sports Festival, and involved a game from the Deep South facing off against a local athletic club or university. The first game was played on Christmas Day in 1907 between the LSU Tigers and Havana University, making this game LSU's first postseason game in program history. And, well, yeah. Sometimes when discussing a game or series, the story around the game is often more enthralling than the games themselves. And there's perhaps no better example than the Bacardi Bowls. All but one will be shutouts, many will be blowouts, sometimes favoring the Americans, sometimes not. And few I personally would consider to be quote-unquote good games. It wasn't meant to be anyways, it was a gimmick game through and through. It'd take 2 more years for the next Bacardi Bowl to be played, this time featuring LSU rival and fellow Louisiana program Tulane against the Cuban Athletic Club. And this time the local team would come out the victor in an 11-0 shutout. 2 years later, and Mississippi A&M is having a year. The predecessor to what is now Mississippi State, the Aggies are coming off a year of disaster and triumph, both of which were present in the final game of the season, the 1911 Egg Bowl. The game would begin with the stands collapsing and injuring 60 spectators, and would end with Mississippi A&M coming out the victor 6-0 against their in-state rival, mostly on behalf of their passing game. Their reward was a berth in the third Bacardi Bowl, where they'd decisively come out the victor in a 12-0 victory. Almost a year later, in December 1912, the Gators would pay a visit to Havana. Now, go to any University of Florida record book and it'll tell you that the Gators' first postseason bowl was the 1953 Gator Bowl. And that's regular for all of these teams, considering the Bacardi Bowl was not an official NCAA recognized bowl. But for Florida, it goes a little bit deeper. It was a doubleheader, with the first game going about as you would expect. The tennis club played football about as well as you'd expect a tennis club to play, and the Gators were ready to square off with the Cuban Athletic Club, when a disagreement came to light. The Cubans were insisting on using pre-1906 football rules that were both incredibly unsafe and mostly unknown to Florida. This, along with the game's ref being a former Cuban head coach, led to Florida's head coach George Pyle calling off the game. Small problem. The spectators already paid for 2 matches, and forfeiting one was a criminal offense. For doing so, Pyle was promptly arrested and released on bail, with a court date in the midst of being organized when Pyle and the Gators promptly got the hell out of Cuba, boarding a steamship heading straight to Tampa. He'd leave Florida the next year for West Virginia, and the university would swiftly wipe the strangest postseason bowl appearance in Florida Gators football history from their records. It'd take almost 10 years for the Cuban exhibition game to see its next combatants, with the 1921 Ole Miss Rebels being the next team up. The only Southern team to be invited with a losing record, having only one conference win against a now Division III program, they were invited alongside their basketball program for a Havana double feature. One they were, for lack of a better term, screwed in. On the surface, their 13-0 shutout loss seems par for the course for the entire season, yet the problems the Gators had seemed to come to the surface in this matchup. All 3 Ole Miss touchdowns were brought back for either being offsides or holding or some other penalty. And the officiating crew only spoke Spanish, so the Rebels didn't even recognize what exactly they were being penalized for. They were worked, plain and simple. The controversy-filled bowl would take an even longer 16-year hiatus before opening back up again, and this time they'd circumvent the home cooking by just inviting 2 American teams to play instead, marking the first time 2 American football programs played on foreign soil. As per usual, the first invitee was a Deep South program, this time the Auburn Tigers, but their opponent would be an odd one. Villanova has come out rolling this year with shutout wins over Penn State and South Carolina, and is looking to top their year with the honor of being the only Northern team to play and win the Bacardi Bowl, with one slight problem. Fulgencio Batista is a decorated man, being a Cuban general, a former Cuban president, and all-round piece of shit. And shortly before the season, he, along with fellow like-minded military men, has led a bloodless coup of the Cuban government, one of many to come. Despite this, though, the game somehow continued. It would be a defensive bout between the 2 cat programs, with the early scoring drought ending with Auburn running back and infielder Billy Hitchcock finding his way to the end zone to take the Tigers up 7-0 going into the second half. The Wildcats would answer back, blocking a kick and landing on the loose ball in the end zone to tie the game 7-7. And 7-7 it would stay, with the 6th Bacardi Bowl ending in a tie. 9 years later, the final Bacardi Bowl would be played, with Southern Miss coming down to shell the University of Havana for one final send-off. The successor to the bowl would come in Tampa, Florida, with the help of the Egypt Temple Shriners, a local group of Freemasons looking for a way to raise some money. They'd sponsor the very first Cigar Bowl, a postseason bowl that would often pit small Floridian programs like Tampa, Rollins, Florida State, etc., against other, smaller programs. Eventually, however, the cost for the bowl itself would outpace the revenue it would bring in, and the Shriners would drop their sponsorship of the game, and the Cigar Bowl itself would fold shortly after. Despite the Bacardi Bowl ending, there still would occasionally be Cuban exhibition games, usually between the University of Havana and smaller southern colleges. The last of these games would be between Stetson and Havana, with the Hatters taking care of business 64-0. Shortly after, these exhibitions would abruptly end for...
He certainly displays great eloquence and a powerful personality.
Se han encontrado con que la revolución cubana sabe también pelear y ganar batallas en este campo.
Some reason. And it'd take 47 years for an American team to play football on Cuban soil again. The spiritual successor to this game remains, however, in the Bahamas Bowl. Founded in 2014, the bowl is essentially the modern incarnation of what the old Bacardi Bowl was. 2 teams from Conference USA and the MAC taking a tropical vacation to the Bahamas and playing some football along the way. Unlike the Bacardi Bowl, however, these games are actually fun, with the bowl opening with a 49-48 barn burner between the Hilltoppers and Chippewas. A feat the Cuban game could rarely ever get close to. What the Bahamas Bowl loses, however, and what makes this weird footnote in college football bowl history interesting, is the lawless, unstratified nature of it. The sense of a vast unknown, of a sport still evolving before the spectator's eyes. The spirit of Bacardi, college football's long-gone frontier.
Honey, please do give me just one more chance in our sophisticated romance, for I love you more than you ever know. In most of my letters I have